Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the FIA Group.
Hello. Hi. It's me, Ron Peck, Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the FIA Group. You are tuned into another episode of Empowering Plans with the FIA Group, the, if you don't mind my saying, best podcast that I've ever done. Definitely the best series of podcasts that I've ever participated in. Actually, it's the only series of podcasts I've ever done. You know, it's unfortunate because I remember when I was, 10, 11, 12, I remember I wrote a Father's Day card to my dad and it said, "You're the best dad I've ever had." And of course, he's the only dad I've ever had. And I thought it was so clever. My 5-year-old just gave me the same card. So he figured that one out in about half the time. So I'm feeling a little down on myself. But speaking of people who make me feel much better about myself, Brady Bizarro is here with me. Brady, how you doing, buddy?
I'm hanging in there, Ron. I'm glad to hear I make you feel
man,
better.
that well, huh? All right, good job. Good job working that mute button. You know, I got to say, we're all getting very good at managing the conference lines, all the phones, features, and things like that. So we're getting a good workout there. Listen, it's still election season. I don't know if you know that. Election season, if I remember correctly, is your time to shine. Am I right?
It is, and we have it, I feel like, all the time now, so it's been great.
It is. And, you know, what's interesting about podcasts versus webinars is that with a webinar, I know when people are hearing it, right? Or at least they should be, because if they're tuned in live, they're hearing it then. Of course, we do provide it recorded to other people, but people who listen to the recorded version, you know, they at least take it with a grain of salt. They accept, you know, I missed the boat. I'm listening to a recorded version. I didn't hear the live show. So things that they talk about that were timely at the time might not be timely now, and I forgive them. It's my fault for not tuning into that live webinar. But a podcast, you know, that social contract, that doesn't exist here, because when you get a podcast, right, well, of course it's recorded. Nobody listens to a podcast as it's being recorded. So there's almost this game that we need to play where we can look into the future and try to pretend that we're talking about current events that haven't actually happened yet, or talk about actual current events as if they happened in the past. And that takes a lot of acrobatic thinking, especially now. And for those who are downloading this podcast and wondering, what is he talking about? Depending on when you're listening to this, the second, quote unquote, presidential debate may have taken place days ago, weeks ago, months ago. But for us, it's fresh. It only happened a night ago. And it was funny because I mentioned to Brady that the first presidential debate, they spent the entire time trying to talk over each other. With the second, they actually figured out a way to accomplish that. And that was by both having a monologue at the same time on channels that were competing. And it makes it really tough for us to take notes and compare, because you got to watch one and then watch a recorded version of the other, or maybe jump back and forth. And it's tough, especially when one candidate brings up a topic or an issue and you really want to hear what the other would have said about it. And now you're going to have to wait. So I got to admit, I was a little disappointed by this format. But c'est la vie, it is what it is. Brady, ultimately, does any of it really matter? Because truth be told, you're the man to tell us what's happening, what decisions need to be made, and where we need to head as a country. Isn't that right?
I take that post very seriously. Look, I think this one probably did not matter if you're talking about the influence on the polls of the election itself. I listened in particular looking to see if anything on healthcare was addressed, because unfortunately there hasn't really been a lot of time spent in these debates on that issue. The first debate, as you mentioned, was kind of a mess. And the second one really, you know, we didn't get the candidates having an exchange. But I thought the moderator from NBC pretty much served as the other candidate, because she was grilling President Trump on a lot of these issues. And she did bring up healthcare on a few questions I think it's important to talk about. He mentioned how the administration, as we know, is currently in court suing right over the Affordable Care Act itself. And if that case goes the way of the administration, then Obamacare could be declared unconstitutional and could be struck down. And the moderator pressed the president on the fact that he does not have a plan yet. He's talked about, you know, he wants to guarantee protections for those with pre-existing conditions. We all know that. But aside from his executive order, which doesn't really have any teeth, there's not really been a comprehensive plan. And I think that's kind of, to me, the biggest liability for the administration on healthcare. And it really should make the rest of the country nervous because, again, if this case goes the way he wants and there's nothing replacing it, right, which was, again, half of their plan was repeal and replace, then I think they're in some big trouble. I think we're in some big trouble because we're not going to know what's going on. I think other than that, though, Ron, in terms of what we learned that was useful, I didn't see much else. The other things that discussed mostly related to strictly politics and didn't really affect our purposes or our industry.
Well, I'm sorry you wasted your time, Brady. I was watching some Sports Center. Apparently, Cam Newton, he's going to be back on the field for the Patriots. That's good news. Hey, listen, you talk about healthcare, you talk about these healthcare plans, and the reason that I think it's kind of taken a back seat to other issues, one is because obviously there's the gorilla in the room, which is COVID, right? The pandemic. What are we doing about that? That's issue number one. But then also, when we were talking about the Democratic primaries, one of the main sort of differentiators between the prospective candidates was their position on things like Medicare for all, right? And whether they were going to be that extreme when it comes to healthcare. And it was, like I said, a major differentiator for those candidates. So, of course, it was a major topic of conversation. I think that ultimately for the general population, the fact that Vice President Biden was selected as the Democratic candidate pretty much for them ended the conversation, right? Because in their mind, well, he's all about Obamacare, right? He's all about the ACA. So if he wins, it's just going to be business as usual. And likewise, with the president, it's the same attitude, which is, well, we know what the president's attitude is regarding healthcare. We know what he's been trying to do. He did not eliminate the ACA. So, maybe he'll continue to, quote unquote, tweak it with executive orders, but I don't really expect much else from him. So really, I think ultimately we're not going to see much of anything as it relates to the ACA or healthcare. So let's move on to something else. That's the attitude out there. And I don't think that people, appreciate what's going on behind the scenes right now regarding the ACA from the Republican standpoint with the lawsuit, which of course you'll be talking about, as well as, sort of the continuing executive orders and other efforts. And also on the flip side, I don't think people necessarily understand what a simple little thing like a quote unquote public option or Medicare for all who want it. People hear that and they think, it's little. It won't have the same kind of impact as Medicare for all. I don't think people necessarily understand or appreciate the impact that would have. Certainly, it will draw things out and slow it down. But as I've said in our blog and in articles, I think a public option could potentially lead eventually to a Medicare for all scenario because the cost is going to be so low because they use the law to enforce a percent of Medicare RBP sort of payment methodology for the public option. You can't compete with that, right? Because here I am, I'm paying providers way less than you are. The law prevents them from balance billing my members, but they can balance bill yours. Everybody's going to go to the cheaper option. Lo and behold, once you have that adverse selection, you're stuck with the sickest of the sick who want the higher grade coverage, but all the healthy people who just need something and want to move on by the cheapest option, which is mine, that makes you top heavy, financially speaking. You're no longer viable. Boom. There's only one option left, the public option. Suddenly you have Medicare for all. People aren't talking about that because it's so drawn out. It's complicated. It's not this sort of soundbite, Medicare for all or not. And so I think that maybe they've been misled, and because it's not as popular or sexy a topic anymore, that's why you're not hearing about it. Brady, you see what's going on behind the scenes, though. You're reading between the lines. What's the reality? As people look at these candidates, what are they not being told? What do they need to be thinking about as far as healthcare is concerned, both where we're headed right now under the current administration and what we could potentially be dealing with if there's a change of president?
I think there's a couple points to make there, Ron, and you hit the nail on the head when you said that a lot of this is paying attention to what's happening behind the scenes, looking deeper, digging deeper. We live in an age where people want sound bites, right? They want to read that really short article and think they're going to get the whole picture. But as we know, that's not how the world works, not lately, not when powerful interests are at stake. So with respect to your concern about Medicare for all, I think that's still a real threat because what I've heard, and I watched an interview yesterday with Senator Bernie Sanders, who said that if the Democrats flip the Senate, which looks like it's pretty likely, or it's at least more than 50-50 at this point, he said that he would be the chairman of the Senate Health Committee, which is the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. That's a powerful committee that deals with healthcare. And you can bet that he'll be pushing a progressive agenda on that committee. And that agenda includes a push toward Medicare for all. So Biden's plan, as our listeners may recall, already calls for lowering the Medicare eligibility age to 60. I've heard Senator Sanders say that he's going to push, if Biden wins and if Senate is flipped to the Democrats, he would push to lower that age even further to 55 and try to basically load up this public option with more people slowly and over time. So there's still quite a threat, I think, of letting this in through the back door over time slowly. That's the one thing to know. And on the other side, I think it's important for people to know that we've also had this 4 days of hearings on the Supreme Court nominee, which it feels like we talk about all the time, but these events are not supposed to happen so frequently, but we've had 3 now in one presidential cycle. And this nominee, Amy Cony Barrett, I think would bring a significant check on, potentially, on a slide to a Medicare for all, and the fact that she would be a strict interpreter of the Constitution. She's an originalist. She, I think, is being put on the court to really bulwark conservative values and conservative positions on healthcare and many other issues. So I think there's a chance that she might, counterbalance whatever may happen at the presidential level. And, it's likely she could rule against or be the deciding vote against the ACA. We'll have to see where that goes. But I think that the takeaway is that there's a lot more happening behind the scenes. There's still a threat, I think, from Medicare for all and the public option. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party is waiting, I think, until we get past this election. And no matter what happens, they're going to be pushing an agenda to move toward a single-payer system.
So speaking of the Supreme Court nominee and the ACA case in Texas, is there anything else we need to know about the status of that case aside from the potential impact that the Supreme Court could have?
Go into more detail on this in an upcoming webinar, depending on when you're listening to this podcast. And I could go on for, an hour or two about the hearings and sort of what this nomination could mean for the ACA and her judicial philosophy and what it might mean for healthcare generally. But look, she was questioned by many senators, in fact, almost all the senators on the Democratic side, about her views on the ACA. So the fear is that she will, in this case, rule that the mandate is unconstitutional and that it cannot be severed from the rest of the statute, and so the whole thing has to fall. I'm not so sure that's what will actually play out here. Again, we'll have more to say on this in our webinar coming up. But I think aside from this case, things to look for. I mentioned that, she's an originalist. She interprets the Constitution as it was originally written, and she's very much in line with her conservative mentor, Justice Scalia. And one of the things that is important to know as it affects healthcare with that kind of viewpoint is we've seen a lot of agency rulemaking in the area of healthcare by this president and others, but a lot by this president.
The one sort of last thing that I want to touch on, and you mentioned that during the webinar, we'll talk a little bit more about sort of the ACA on trial and just the timing of things. I think, your point about how timing is important. I know one thing we talked about during the last webinar and on the last podcast, but it continues to stick in my craw, is that the timing is almost shockingly coincidental, where you have the potential for a Supreme Court justice that would likely side against the ACA's constitutionality, paired with a decent likelihood that the Congress and Senate will be turned over, like you mentioned, Bernie Sanders leading the Health Committee, and a president that supported at the very least a public option. If things went that way, where step one, the ACA is deemed to be unconstitutional and thrown out in its entirety, and step two, you have now a Senate and a president that are as in support of Medicare for all, if not more so, than the administration that was in place at the time that the ACA was passed. Is there not a possibility that something even more extreme could come in to fill that void that the Supreme Court creates? It's almost strange in a way where you could potentially see a nominee put in the Supreme Court by the Republicans actually end up creating a void that plays to the more liberal or left-inclined Democratic lawmakers.
Yeah, I think that's a real concern. I've said that the president's sort of failure to have a comprehensive plan on healthcare is drawing criticism from both sides of the aisle, because on the left, they're saying, look, 20 million people where there's no plan to replace it. And on the right, they're saying, if you don't have a plan to replace the ACA and it's struck down, you're going to create this big void, and it's going to be rushed to be filled by whoever's in control. And if it's the Democrats, then who knows what we'll see. So I think that's definitely a really big threat, and we'll have to watch it going forward, and we'll know pretty soon, because we'll know how this election, or we think we'll know how this election turns out in a matter of a couple weeks.
A lot to watch for, a lot at stake. I know when you watch these debates, you think, they don't have anything good to talk about. Maybe that's so, but what's being said versus what's actually going on are two very different things, and there is a lot at stake. Like I said, listen, folks, we're going to keep you updated. We're going to do the best we can to keep you informed. Don't rely just on what you see or read. Dig deep, read between the lines, and understand what the ripple effect of these decisions will have. And continue to tune in to the Empowering Plans podcast with the FIA Group. On behalf of myself, Pat, Brady, and the rest of the company, we really appreciate you. We hope you're doing well, and we'll hopefully be seeing and shaking your hand soon. But until then, like I said, be well, listen in, and keep empowering those plans. Thank you.